The regulator clock on the wall of Sheriff Silas Thorne's office ticked loudly in the pre-dawn silence. 5:30 in the morning, and the town of Redemption, Kansas, hadn't yet stirred. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp on his desk, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Silas sat with his elbows on the desk, his rough hands folded in front of him. His eyes weren't on the clock or the window watching for trouble. They were fixed on a piece of paper in front of him. A wanted poster. The paper was creased and yellowed around the edges, and if you got close enough, you could smell the faint trace of horse and mud that had been trampled into it out on Main Street yesterday afternoon. His thumb rested directly over the face printed on the poster. The ink drawing showed a man with hard eyes and a thin mouth. Caleb Vance. The name sat beneath the image like a weight. And beneath that name, in bold letters, the words "wanted for murder" stood out like a scar. Silas pressed his thumb down gently, covering the face completely. Outside, the first hint of grey light touched the horizon. Inside, the lamp flickered once, the flame dancing behind the glass chimney. The office smelled like coffee from yesterday morning, old paper, and the leather of his gun belt hanging on the corner of his chair. A fly buzzed against the window glass, trapped between the world outside and the world in here. Silas watched it for a moment, then looked back at the poster. This was the moment folks might call peaceful. The calm before the town woke up. But Silas didn't feel peace. He felt something else entirely. Something hollow. For 10 years, he'd carried the memory of his younger brother, Thomas. Thomas with the easy laugh and the bad habit of trusting the wrong people. Thomas, who'd gotten mixed up with the Vance gang and ended up dead in a dusty street not 50 miles from here. For 10 years, Silas had dreamed of this poster. Had imagined the day someone would walk into his office and say the words. And 3 days ago, someone had. A deputy from Wichita rode in with news. Caleb Vance was caught. Locked up. Waiting for trial in the county seat. Silas had expected to feel something big. Rage, maybe. Or relief. Instead, he felt nothing. Just a strange, hollow quiet that disturbed him more than any anger ever could. He'd sit here in the mornings now, looking at the poster, pressing his thumb to that face, and wondering why the fire inside him had gone out. The clock ticked. 5:45. He thought about the last time he'd seen Thomas alive. They'd argued. Thomas wanted to ride west, chase some dream of easy money. Silas told him he was a fool. Thomas laughed and said maybe he was, but at least he was a living fool. Those were his last words. Living fool. Silas pulled his thumb away from the poster and looked at the face again. In 2 weeks, there'd be a trial. And after that, a hanging. And after that, this chapter of his life would close forever. He should have felt eager for that day. Instead, he felt tired. Tired in his bones. The lamp flickered again. 5:47. A horse whinnied somewhere down the street. Probably Old Man Henderson's mare, always restless before sunrise. The fly kept buzzing against the glass. Silas reached over and opened the window a crack. The fly found the opening and disappeared into the grey morning air. He watched it go and wondered if he'd ever feel that simple. That free. His eyes drifted back to the poster one more time. He read the words again, though he knew them by heart. Wanted for murder. Cattle rustling. Armed robbery. The list went on. But it was the murder part that mattered. Thomas's face flashed in his mind. 23 years old. Buried in a cemetery his mother never got to visit. Silas let out a long breath and rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands. When he opened them again, he looked at the regulator clock on the wall. 5:48. 13 minutes until he'd wake the deputies and start the day. 13 minutes of quiet. He reached for his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. The hollow feeling in his chest hadn't moved. If anything, it had grown bigger. He wondered if this was what healing felt like. Or if this was something worse. Maybe letting go of the hate meant letting go of Thomas too. And he wasn't sure he was ready for that. The floorboards creaked somewhere in the back. Old building settling. Nothing more. The lamp cast its warm glow across the wanted poster, and for just a moment, Silas thought he saw Thomas's face instead of Vance's. Just a trick of the light. Just his tired eyes playing games. He blinked, and it was gone. 5:49. He reached out and straightened the poster on his desk. The edges were curled up. He pressed them flat with his fingers. A small gesture, but it felt important somehow. Like he was putting things in order before the day began. Outside, a rooster crowed in the distance. The sky was getting lighter now. Soon the town would wake up. Soon there'd be people to see, problems to solve, duties to perform. But right now, in this moment, there was just Silas and the poster and the ticking clock. He thought about his mother. About how she'd cried at the funeral. About how she'd held Thomas's hat in her lap for a year afterward. About how she'd never once said the word revenge. She'd just said, "Take care of yourself, Silas." That's what Thomas would want. He'd nodded and promised. But he'd never stop hunting. Never stopped hoping for this moment. And now the moment was here, and he felt nothing. 5:50. The floorboards creaked again, louder this time. Not settling. Footsteps. Running footsteps. Silas straightened in his chair, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. The hollow feeling vanished, replaced by something sharp and alert. The door burst open before he could stand. Deputy Miller stumbled inside, his face pale as ash, his chest heaving like he'd run all the way from the county seat. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wide. Silas was on his feet now, his chair scraping against the floor. The lamp rattled on the desk. Miller grabbed the doorframe to steady himself, his mouth opening and closing, trying to find words. The clock on the wall ticked once. Twice. Miller finally found his voice. It came out rough and broken, like glass grinding under a boot. They took him, Silas. The words hung in the air between them. Silas felt them hit his chest like something solid. Like a fist. Like a bullet. The air left his lungs in a rush he couldn't control. Miller kept talking, the words spilling out in a flood. The Vance gang. They hit the transport at dawn. Killed the driver. Killed 2 guards. They got him back. He's gone. Silas heard the words, but they seemed to come from far away. From the end of a long tunnel. His hand was still on his gun. His heart was pounding now, loud in his ears. The hollow feeling was gone completely. In its place, something else was rising. Something hot and familiar and dangerous. He looked down at the desk. At the wanted poster. At the face of Caleb Vance, staring up at him from the yellowed paper. Then he looked at the clock. 5:52. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed his hat from the hook by the door and walked out into the growing light, the deputy following close behind, the sound of the regulator clock fading with each step he took away from the only moment of peace he'd known in 10 years. The morning sun had barely cleared the mesas when Silas Thorne rode into Main Street, but the light already felt wrong. Harsher than it should be. The kind of light that showed every crack in the wood and every stain in the dirt. The kind of light you saw after something bad had happened, when the world kept going even though part of it had broken. Silas pulled his horse to a stop and swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the dust with a soft thump, and for a moment, he just stood there. Looking. Breathing. The air tasted like gunsmoke and something else. Something metallic. Blood. He'd know that taste anywhere. Main Street looked different now than it had an hour ago. The boardwalks were empty. Doors were closed. Curtains twitched in windows as folks watched from behind glass. But out in the open, in the middle of everything, the town of Redemption had been marked. 2 bodies lay in the street. Silas walked toward them, his legs moving without him telling them to. His knees popped with each step. 46 years old, and every one of those years showed up in his joints on mornings like this. He stopped beside the first body and looked down. Deputy Frank Mills. 22 years old. Had a sweetheart in Wichita. Talked about her all the time. Now he lay on his back in the dust, his eyes open to the sky, a dark stain spreading across his chest. His hand still rested near his gun. He never got it out. Silas crouched down and closed Frank's eyes with 2 fingers. The skin was still warm. Still soft. He stood up and walked to the next body. Deputy Harry Watson. 51 years old. Married 30 years. Had a daughter getting married next spring. Now he lay on his side, curled like he'd fallen asleep. Only he hadn't. The dust around him was dark and wet. Silas counted the steps between the bodies in his head. 18 feet. They'd been standing guard outside the jail. They never stood a chance. Behind him, he heard Miller dismount. Heard the deputy's boots hit the ground. Heard him start to speak, then stop. There weren't words for this. There never were. Silas turned toward the jail. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. He walked up the 3 wooden steps, his hand resting on his gun, though he knew there was no danger here anymore. The gang was long gone. They'd come for one thing and one thing only. He stepped inside. The jail was a mess. Desk drawers pulled out and dumped on the floor. Papers scattered everywhere. The window by the door was shattered, glass crunching under his boots. But Silas didn't look at any of that. His eyes went straight to the cell. The door stood open. Not unlocked. Open. The lock itself lay on the floor, a single clean bullet hole drilled right through the key mechanism. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. One shot, and the lock was useless. No keys needed. No time wasted. Silas picked up the lock and turned it over in his hand. Still warm. The metal smelled like gunpowder. He set it on the desk and looked around the room again, this time really looking. There, by the far wall, a dark smear on the floor. Blood. And leading away from it, footprints. Boot prints. 2 sets. One walking steady, one stumbling, dragging a heel. He followed the prints to the door and out onto the boardwalk. They turned left, toward the livery. Toward the back of Main Street where the buildings cast long shadows even in the morning light. Miller appeared beside him. Silas, I'm sorry. I should have been here. I should have. Where are they now? Silas asked. His voice came out flat. Calm. The calm before something. Gone. Rode out east toward the flats. But Silas, they left someone behind. A man, hurt bad. A boy saw him crawl into the livery. Silas looked at Miller for a long moment. Then he stepped off the boardwalk and walked toward the livery, his boots leaving deep prints in the soft dirt. The livery doors were open. Inside, it was dark and cool, the air thick with the smell of hay and horses and old leather. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, making stripes across the floor. Silas stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. A horse stamped in one of the stalls. Somewhere, a pigeon cooed from the rafters. And in the far corner, half hidden behind a pile of hay, a man lay on his side, breathing in short, wet gasps. Silas walked toward him slowly, his hand on his gun. The man didn't move. Didn't try to run. When Silas got close enough, he saw why. Caleb Vance lay in the hay with his hands pressed to his stomach. Blood soaked through his shirt and ran between his fingers, dark and thick. His face was pale, slick with sweat. His eyes were closed, but they opened when Silas's shadow fell across him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was Vance's breathing, each breath a struggle, each exhale a wet rattle. Then Vance's mouth curved into a smile. A bloody-toothed grin that held no warmth, no humor, nothing but pure hate. His lips moved, and the words came out in a whisper rough as gravel. Go on. Finish the job. Silas stood there, looking down at the man who'd killed his brother. The man he'd hunted for 10 years. The man who'd ordered the murder of 2 deputies not 2 hours ago. He lay in the hay like a wounded animal, waiting for the end. And for one long, terrible moment, Silas thought about doing it. Thought about drawing his gun and ending this right here. Right now. No trial. No waiting. No hollow feeling. Just justice, quick and final. His hand tightened on the grip of his revolver. Vance watched him, still smiling. Still waiting. Blood bubbled between his lips with each breath. Outside, Silas heard Miller calling his name. Heard the distant sound of women crying. Heard the creak of wagon wheels as someone moved a body. And inside, he heard something else. Something quieter. The sound of his own heartbeat. Steady. Strong. Alive. He looked at Vance again. At the blood. At the smile. At the eyes that dared him to do it. Then he let go of his gun. He turned and walked to the livery door. Miller stood there, his face questioning. Silas looked past him, toward the town. Toward the bodies still lying in the street. Toward the families who'd soon be mourning. "Get the doctor," Silas said. Miller blinked. "What?" "The doctor. Get him. Now." "But Silas, that's Caleb Vance. That's the man who—" "I know who it is." Silas's voice cracked, just a little. "Just enough. I know exactly who it is. Now get the doctor before he bleeds out. That's an order." Miller stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and ran. Silas stood in the livery doorway, the sun warm on his face, the smell of blood and hay following him out into the light. Behind him, Caleb Vance coughed once, then fell silent. And Silas Thorne, for the first time in 10 years, had no idea what came next. The sun had slipped behind the western mesas by the time Silas carried Caleb Vance into the back room of the jail. The town of Redemption had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when folks are scared and don't know what comes next. Windows were shuttered. Doors were locked. Even the dogs had stopped barking. Silas laid Vance on the cot in the corner and stood there for a moment, catching his breath. The man weighed more than he looked, and carrying him from the livery had left Silas's arms burning and his shirt soaked through with sweat. Or maybe not all of that sweat was from the carrying. Vance's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, each breath a tiny victory. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. The front of his shirt was dark red, nearly black in the fading light. Silas had seen enough gunshot wounds to know what came next. If they didn't do something soon, Caleb Vance would be dead before midnight. The doctor never came. Silas had sent Miller to find him, and Miller had come back alone. Doc Harrison had taken one look at the gang riding east and decided he had urgent business in the next county. Can't say Silas blamed him. The Vance gang had a reputation. They'd killed doctors before. But still, the news left Silas standing in that back room with a dying man and no one to help. What now? Miller asked from the doorway. Silas looked at Vance, then at the lamp on the table, then at the iron poker leaning against the potbelly stove in the corner. His stomach turned. "Build up the fire," he said. "Hot as you can get it." Miller's face went pale. "Silas, you can't be serious. That man killed Frank and Harry. He killed your brother. You can't." "I can't let him die either." Silas's voice came out harder than he meant it to. "Not like this. Not before the gang comes back. You think they're done? They left him here because they thought he was dead. When they figure out he's not, they'll be back. And next time, they won't just shoot the lock off a door." Miller stood there for a long moment, his jaw working like he wanted to say something else. Then he walked to the stove and started feeding wood into it. The fire caught quickly, casting orange light across the room. Silas pulled Vance's shirt open. The wound was low on his belly, just above the hip. A bullet had gone clean through, but not before tearing up everything in between. Blood welled up from the hole with each breath. Silas pressed a cloth against it, and Vance groaned without opening his eyes. The clock on the wall read 7:32. Outside, the last light was dying. Miller got the fire hot, then stood back. Silas picked up the iron poker and held the end in the flames. He watched it change color, from gray to red to something almost white. The heat coming off it felt like a living thing. "You don't have to watch this," Silas said. Miller shook his head. "I'm not leaving you alone with him." So they waited. The poker glowed. The clock ticked. Vance breathed. At 7:48, Silas pulled the poker from the fire. The air around it shimmered with heat. He walked to the cot and looked down at the man who'd destroyed his family. Vance's eyes were open now, watching him, understanding. "You're going to scream," Silas said quietly. "Scream all you want. There's no one left in town to hear you anyway." Vance's mouth opened, but before he could speak, Silas pressed the hot iron against the wound. The sound that came out of Caleb Vance was not human. It was high and raw and went on, filling the small room until Silas thought the walls might crack. The smell of burning flesh hit the back of his throat, sweet and terrible, and his stomach lurched. He held the iron steady, counting in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he pulled it away and stepped back, his hand shaking. Vance's body went limp. His eyes rolled back. His head lolled to the side. For one horrible moment, Silas thought he'd killed him. Then Vance's chest rose, fell, rose again. Still alive. Still breathing. Miller handed Silas a canteen without being asked. Silas drank, the water warm and tinny against his tongue. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at what he'd done. The wound was sealed now. Ugly and raw, but sealed. Vance might live. Might. The clock read 7:55. Silas sat down in the chair by the wall, suddenly too tired to stand. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He put them under his legs to hide it. Miller said nothing. Just stood there, watching the unconscious man on the cot. Time passed. The clock ticked. The fire crackled. Outside, the night grew dark and deep. At 9 o'clock, the town bell rang. 10 slow notes, marking the hour. Silas had rung that bell himself 100 times. Now it sounded different. Lonelier. Vance stirred on the cot. His eyes fluttered open, found Silas, and held. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Silas stood up and walked to the window. The street outside was empty. Dark. Somewhere out there, the Vance gang was waiting. Planning. Getting ready. He turned back to look at the man on the cot. His enemy. His prisoner. His patient. The lines between those things had blurred so much he couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Something on the floor caught his eye. A scrap of paper, half hidden under the cot. Must have fallen from Vance's boot when they brought him in. Silas bent down and picked it up. It was folded small, creased, and dirty. He opened it carefully, the paper thin and fragile in his fingers. The handwriting inside made his heart stop. He knew that handwriting. Had seen it 1,000 times on letters his mother kept in her dresser drawer. Had seen it on notes left on the kitchen table. Had seen it on the last letter he ever received, 10 years ago, just before everything changed. Thomas. His brother's hand. Silas read the words once. Then again. His vision blurred. He blinked hard and read them a third time. Help. They won't let me leave. Tell them I'm good for it. Tell them you'll pay. Tell them anything. Just get me out. I'm in too deep. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please. The date at the top was 2 weeks before Thomas died. Silas stood there in the flickering lamplight, the paper trembling in his hands. The words swam before his eyes. Help. They won't let me leave. In too deep. All these years, he'd believed Thomas was a victim. An innocent boy who fell in with bad men and got killed for it. He'd built his whole life around that belief. The hunting. The waiting. The hate. It all rested on one simple truth. And then Silas realized that truth was a lie. Thomas hadn't been taken by the Vance gang. He'd joined them. Gotten in over his head. Owed them money. And when he couldn't pay, he'd written to Silas, begging for help that never came. Silas folded the paper carefully, his movements slow and precise. He put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. Then he walked to the cot and looked down at Caleb Vance. Vance's eyes were open. Watching him. He'd seen what Silas found. He knew. He was with you, Silas said. His voice came out quiet. Wondering. From the beginning. Vance nodded, just a little. Tried to leave. Couldn't. We don't let people leave. Silas stood there for a long time, the weight of 10 years pressing down on his shoulders. Everything he'd believed. Everything he'd done. It all looked different now. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9:30. Outside, the night waited. And Silas Thorne, for the first time in his life, didn't know who the enemy was anymore. The clock on the wall read 11:47 when Silas Thorne made his decision. He stood in the back room of the jail, the scrap of paper still resting in his shirt pocket over his heart, and looked at Caleb Vance lying on the cot. The man's eyes were closed, his breathing steady now, the worst of the bleeding stopped. Silas thought about Thomas. About the letter. About 10 years of hate built on a lie. Then he thought about the men riding toward redemption right now. Vance's brothers. Vance's gang. Men who'd killed 2 deputies this morning and would kill again before sunrise. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. The moon was up, nearly full, casting silver light across the boardwalks. A dog trotted past, heading for cover. Even the animals knew something was coming. Miller appeared in the doorway. Silas, we need to talk about this. There's maybe 6 of them out there. Maybe more. It's just us. We can't hold them off. We're not holding them off, Silas said without turning around. We are stopping them. How? By yourself? You're one man. Silas turned from the window. His eyes found Vance on the cot, then moved to the cell door lying on the floor, then to the shotgun leaning against the wall. An idea was forming. A dangerous one. He knows them, Silas said, nodding toward Vance. Knows how they think. Knows how they fight. We use that. Miller's face went pale. You can't trust him. He's the enemy. He killed. I know what he did. Silas cut him off. I know everything now. And right now, he's the only weapon we've got. He walked to the cot and looked down at Vance. The man's eyes opened, meeting his. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Silas pulled the letter from his pocket and held it up. You knew, he said quietly. All these years, you knew my brother was in over his head. You knew he tried to leave. You knew he wrote to me. Vance nodded slowly. Knew. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? Silas thought about that. About the man he'd been 10 years ago. 5 years ago. Even yesterday. Would he have believed the enemy telling him his brother wasn't innocent? Probably not. Probably he'd have shot the messenger and kept on hating. No, he admitted. Probably not. He tucked the letter back in his pocket. Then he reached down and helped Vance sit up. The man groaned, one hand going to his wounded side, but he didn't fall back. He sat there, breathing hard, looking at Silas with something that might have been confusion. Your brothers are coming, Silas said. You know it. I know it. They left you for dead, but when they don't see a body, they'll come looking. Probably figure you talked. Figure you gave them up. That makes you a target same as me. Vance said nothing. Just watched. Here's the truth of it, Silas continued. I can't hold them off alone. Miller can't either. But you know them. You know how they move, how they think, where they'll come from. So here's my offer. You help me stop them, and when this is over, you go back in that cell and stand trial. Fair trial. No rope before the judge speaks. And if I say no? Silas shrugged. Then I chain you to that cot and you wait here while they come through that door. Your choice. Vance looked at him for a long time. The clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. Why? Vance asked finally. Why not just let me die? Let them come and finish it? Be easier for you. Silas thought about the question. About all the reasons he should say yes. All the reasons letting Vance die would solve everything. Then he thought about Thomas. About the letter. About the weight in his chest that had finally started to shift. Because I spent 10 years hating the wrong man for the wrong reasons, he said quietly. Because 2 good deputies died today and their families deserve to see justice done the right way. Because if I let you die in here without a trial, I'm no better than the men riding toward us." He paused, looked Vance in the eye. "And because my brother made mistakes. Bad ones. But he was still my brother. Still loved. Still worth remembering right. I can't change what happened to him. But I can decide who I am from here on out." Vance stared at him. The confusion in his eyes deepened, then slowly shifted into something else. Something that might have been respect. Might have been. "Front window first," Vance said. "My brother Luke always takes the front. Thinks he's the leader. He'll come straight down Main Street, bold as anything. The others will circle around back. Cover the exits." Silas nodded. "How many?" 5. Maybe 6. Luke, the 2 cousins, the James boys from Abilene, and maybe Bill Dawson if he's still riding with them. 6 then. Silas turned to Miller. "Get the lanterns. All of them. Put one in every window facing the street. Then take the shotgun and cover the back." Miller hesitated. "Silas, you sure about this?" "I'm sure. Go." Miller went. Silas turned back to Vance. "Can you walk?" Vance pushed himself off the cot, one hand on the wall for support. His face went white with the effort, but he stayed upright. "Yeah. Walk. Can't run, but I can walk." "Good. You're going in the chair by the window." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Bait." "Bait," Silas agreed. "They see you alive. They'll come close. Want to finish what they started. That gives me one clean shot at Luke before the rest know what's happening." "You're using me." "I'm using everything I've got. You included." Vance thought about that. Then he nodded slowly and limped toward the chair Silas pointed to. He sat down heavily, his profile visible through the window glass, a perfect silhouette in the lantern light. Silas moved through the room quickly, his hands working while his mind raced. He took the remaining lanterns and placed them strategically. One on the desk. One on the shelf by the door. One on the floor in the corner, half hidden. He loaded every gun he could find, stacking them on the table within reach. Then he started on the traps. A tripwire strung low across the back door, connected to a shotgun propped barrel high. A lantern balanced precariously above the front entrance, tied to a rope that would spill oil and fire if the door opened hard. A chair wedged under the back window, ready to fall and make noise at the first touch. Vance watched him work from the chair by the window. "You think like us," he said quietly. "Like outlaws." Silas didn't look up. "I've been hunting you for 10 years. Had to learn." The clock struck 12. Midnight. The witching hour. Outside, the street lay empty and silver in the moonlight. Inside, the lanterns flickered and the shadows danced. Silas took his position behind the desk, his revolver in his hand, his eyes fixed on the window and the man in the chair. Vance sat still, his hands on his knees, his face calm. Waiting. The minutes crawled past. 12:03. 12:05. 12:07. Then Silas saw it. A shadow that moved wrong at the edge of the boardwalk. Then another. Dark shapes slipping between buildings, low and fast. "They're here," he whispered. Vance nodded, just a fraction. His eyes were on the street, watching his brothers come. The first shot came from nowhere. Glass shattered somewhere down the street. A horse screamed. Then everything went dark as the lantern in front of the jail exploded, plunging the street into chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness. Silas fired at the last place he'd seen a shadow, heard a grunt, knew he'd hit something. He moved to the next position, firing again, not thinking, just reacting. His hands knew what to do even if his mind was still catching up. In the flashes, he saw Vance slump from the chair, hit the floor, crawl toward cover. Good. Smart. The bait had served its purpose. The front door burst open. A man filled the frame, gun raised. Silas fired twice. The man fell back into the night. From the back, He heard Miller's shotgun roar. Once. Twice. Then silence. Silas reloaded by feel, his fingers finding bullets in the dark, sliding them home. Another shadow at the window. He fired. Glass sprayed. The shadow fell. Then, suddenly, quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when you're not sure if it's really over or just catching its breath. Silas stood behind the desk, his gun trained on the door, waiting. His heart pounded in his ears. His breath came in short gasps. The door creaked. Slowly, carefully, a man stepped through. Not tall. Stocky. Mean-looking. Luke Vance, Caleb's brother. His gun was already raised, already aimed. But not at Silas. At the corner where Caleb Vance lay on the floor, wounded and helpless. Luke's finger tightened on the trigger. His eyes were cold. Empty. This wasn't a rescue. This was a cleanup. Silas had a split second. One breath. One heartbeat. One choice. He could let it happen. Let Luke finish what the gang started. Let Caleb die and be done with it. Walk away clean. Or he could move. The choice wasn't a choice at all. Not really. Not anymore. Silas Thorne threw himself across the room, his body a shield between the gun and the man on the floor. He hit Caleb hard, knocking them both sideways as Luke's gun went off. The bullet burned past Silas's ribs, tearing through his shirt and the skin beneath. He landed on top of Caleb, rolled, came up with his own gun raised. Luke was already aiming again. Their eyes met. Two men. One room. One bullet between them. And then the world stopped. 3 days later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the sheriff's office in Redemption, Kansas, and for the first time in a long while, the town felt quiet in a good way. Not the scared quiet of people hiding behind closed doors. The peaceful quiet of folks going about their business, knowing the danger had passed. Sheriff Silas Thorne sat at his desk, the same desk he'd sat at every morning for the past 12 years. The regulator clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the hour. 9:37. Late for him. Usually he was up by 5. But these past few days had taken something out of him. Something he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. He shifted in his chair and felt the pull of fresh bandages around his ribs. The bullet graze from that night had bled plenty but hadn't done real damage. Doc Harrison had finally shown up the next morning, full of apologies and excuses. Silas had listened, nodded, and sent him on his way. No point in holding grudges. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. The desk in front of him looked different now. Cleaner. The stacks of wanted posters that usually covered every inch of wood had been sorted through. Most went in the trash. A few went in a box to be sent to other counties. And one, the one with Caleb Vance's face on it, was simply gone. Silas had burned it himself, 2 days ago, in the potbelly stove. Watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Watched the face of his enemy disappear into smoke. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like closing a book he'd been reading for too long. The cell door stood open across the room. The lock that had been shot clean through still lay on the floor where it had fallen. Silas hadn't picked it up yet. Wasn't sure he wanted to. Some things were worth leaving as reminders. Miller came through the front door, a cup of coffee in each hand. He set one on the desk in front of Silas and took the chair across from him. The young deputy looked tired but relieved. The circles under his eyes said he hadn't slept much either. Luke Vance is on the morning train to Wichita, Miller said. Sheriff, they're wired ahead. They'll have him in court by end of week. Silas nodded. Took a sip of coffee. It was hot and strong, just the way he liked it. The cousins? He asked. Dead. Both of them. James' boys too. Bill Dawson got away clean, but there's a reward out now. He won't last long. Silas nodded again. 6 men had ridden into Redemption that night. 5 were gone. 1 was in custody. The numbers added up, but they didn't tell the whole story. They never did. Miller hesitated, then said, Caleb Vance is still in the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson's been feeding him. Says he's polite. Keeps to himself. Pays for his room. Silas had known that. Had made sure of it, actually. After that night, after Luke was taken down and the shooting stopped, Silas had walked Caleb back to the boarding house himself. Helped him up the stairs. Told Mrs. Patterson to put it on the town account. He's supposed to stand trial, Miller said quietly. That was the deal. He helps, he gets a fair trial. I know. Folks are talking. Some of them think he should be in that cell right now. Others think he should be dead. A few are saying you went soft. Silas looked at Miller over the rim of his coffee cup. What do you think? Miller thought about it. Took a long drink of his own coffee. Set the cup down carefully. I think you did what you had to do, he said finally. I think if it was me, I don't know if I could have done the same. And I think maybe that's why you're the sheriff and I'm not. Silas almost smiled. Almost. Go check on the livery, he said. Make sure they fix that back wall proper. Miller nodded and left. The door closed softly behind him. Silas sat alone with the ticking clock and his coffee and the empty space on his desk where the wanted poster used to be. The morning light fell across the wood, warm and golden. Dust motes danced in the air. He thought about Thomas. About the letter in his pocket. About the brother he'd loved and the man he'd turned out to be. It still hurt. Probably always would. But the hurt was different now. Softer. More like sadness than rage. He pulled the letter out and read it one more time. The words hadn't changed. Thomas's handwriting, shaky and desperate. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please. Silas folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. Some things you carried with you forever. That was just the way of it. The door opened again. Silas looked up, expecting Miller back with some new problem. It wasn't Miller. Caleb Vance stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame for support, the other holding his side where the wound was still healing. He looked better than 3 days ago. Color had returned to his face. His eyes were clear. He wore clean clothes, borrowed from someone in town, and his hair was combed back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The clock ticked. The dust motes danced. The morning sun made a rectangle of light on the floor between them. Then Caleb walked in. Slowly. Carefully. Each step costing him something. He made it to the desk and stopped, looking down at the empty space where his face used to be. You burned it, he said. Not a question. I burned it. Caleb nodded slowly. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the open cell, the broken lock on the floor, the fresh bandage visible through Silas's shirt. Then his hand went to his pocket. He pulled something out and set it on the desk. A small river stone, smooth and flat, worn by years of water. The kind of stone you'd skip across a pond. The kind of stone kids collected in their pockets and forgot about until laundry day. Silas looked at the stone. Then at Caleb. Then back at the stone. Found it by the creek this morning, Caleb said. Made me think of something. What's that? Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Quiet. My brother and I used to skip stones. When we were kids. Before everything went wrong. Before we became who we became. He nodded toward the stone. That's the only good memory I got. The only one worth keeping. Figured maybe you could keep this one for me. Till I get out. Silas picked up the stone. It was warm from being held. Smooth under his fingers. He turned it over, feeling its weight. Small. Ordinary. Worth nothing to anyone who didn't know its story. Why me? Silas asked. Caleb looked at him. Really looked. For the first time since they'd met, there was no hate in his eyes. No anger. Just something tired and honest. Because you jumped in front of a bullet for me, he said. Because you could have let me die a dozen times and you didn't. Because my own brother aimed at me and yours took the shot instead. He paused. Swallowed hard. Because you showed me something I thought was dead in this world. And I need to remember it. Even if I'm sitting in a cell for the next 20 years, I need to remember there's still good people out there. Silas held the stone for a long moment. Then he closed his fingers around it and nodded. "I'll keep it," he said, "till you get out." Caleb nodded, turned, walked slowly to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back. "The trial's next month," he said. "I'll be there." "I know." "You going to be in that courtroom?" Silas thought about it. About facing the man who'd been part of his brother's death. About testifying. About watching justice take its course. "I'll be there," he said. Caleb nodded once. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Silas sat at his desk, the stone warm in his palm. He looked at the empty space where the wanted poster used to be. Looked at the open cell. Looked at the morning light falling across everything, warm and golden and new. He slipped the stone into his vest pocket, over his heart, right next to Thomas's letter. 2 weights. 2 reminders. One of the past, one of the future. The clock ticked on. 9:52. Outside, the town of Redemption went about its day. Wagon wheels creaked. Children laughed somewhere. A blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm. Silas Thorne sat in his chair and listened to the sounds of life continuing. He thought about his brother. About the man who'd just walked out his door. About the stone in his pocket and the letter next to it. He didn't feel peace exactly. That wasn't the right word. But he felt something. Something that had been missing for 10 years. He felt like himself again. Like the man he used to be before the hate moved in. Like the sheriff this town deserved. The clock struck 10. Silas stood up, wincing just a little at the pull in his ribs. He walked to the window and looked out at Main Street. People were moving about, living their lives. The sun was warm on his face. In his pocket, the stone rested against his chest. Small, smooth, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know if Caleb Vance would keep his word and show up for trial. Didn't know if the healing would last. Didn't know if the town would ever feel completely safe again. But standing there in the morning light, with the stone warm against his heart, Silas Thorne realized something important. Some things weren't about knowing. They were about hoping. About believing that people could change. About trusting that the hard moments could lead to something better. The clock ticked on. The sun climbed higher. And Sheriff Silas Thorne, for the first time in 10 years, was ready to face whatever came next.